Everyone thinks they know the Black Dahlia. They think she was a failed actress, a Hollywood wannabe, a reckless girl chasing fame who paid the price. That story is convenient. It's also wrong. Elizabeth Short wasn't famous because of Hollywood. She was made famous by how she was found, not who she was. January 1947, Los Angeles. Her body placed deliberately in a vacant lot. Posed, drained of blood, surgically altered with precision that stopped detectives cold. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't random. And it sure as hell wasn't about a girl who partied too hard. This was control. This was staging. This was someone who wanted the body discovered. And the narrative distorted. The press turned her into a caricature. The LAPD chased ghosts. And the public swallowed the myth because it was easier than the truth. Tonight, we strip the legend down to bone. No Hollywood fantasy, no salacious garbage, no armchair psychics or recycled suspects, just documented facts, behavioral realities, and the parts of this case that were ignored because they didn't fit the story America wanted to tell. This is Deadly Truth. And this is who the Black Dahlia actually was, and why her murder was never as mysterious as people claim. Elizabeth wasn't born mysterious. She was born ordinary, and that matters. Elizabeth Short was called the Black Dahlia after her murder, not in life. A nickname coined by journalists, likely inspired by the popular 1946 film The Blue Dahlia and her habit of wearing black clothing. There is no credible evidence that people commonly called her that nickname while she was alive. It was a media creation, not a personal moniker. She came into the world in 1924 in Hyde Park, Massachusetts. Irish Catholic family, 5 kids, working class. The kind of upbringing history usually forgets unless something goes very wrong later. Her father faked his own death during the Great Depression, staged a car crash, vanished, started a new life. That wasn't a trauma arc. That was abandonment with paperwork missing. Her mother raised the kids alone, poor, embarrassed, and angry. Elizabeth grew up watching adults disappear when things got hard. File that away. She was sick a lot. Asthma, bronchitis, weak lungs. Doctors told her California air might help. That's how the myth starts. Sent west for her health. Sounds noble. Sounds gentle. Reality. She bounced back and forth because no one could afford her, and no one really knew what to do with her. She wasn't shipped to Hollywood by destiny. She drifted there because there was nowhere else to go. She wasn't a starlet. She didn't have an agent. She didn't have auditions lined up. She had looks, time, and a fantasy, which in 1940s America was enough to get you attention but not protection. She worked odd jobs, stayed with acquaintances, sometimes men she barely knew, not because she was reckless, because that's how survival worked for women without money. Hollywood didn't chew people up. It let them starve slowly and called it opportunity. She liked the image. The black hair, the white makeup, the clothes she couldn't afford. That wasn't delusion. That was branding, before branding had a name. And yes, she told stories about producers, about connections, about being close to a break. Everyone did. Hollywood runs on lies the way Vegas runs on oxygen. Here's the part people hate hearing. Elizabeth didn't fall into danger. She lived in it. She was transient, broke, visible, and alone in a city that fed on exactly that combination. No safety net, no industry backing, no family nearby, just charm, resilience, and a lot of bus tickets. California didn't corrupt her. It exposed her. And when she ended up in Los Angeles for the last time, she wasn't chasing fame anymore. She was chasing stability, a place to stay, someone who wouldn't disappear, which tragically puts her right where predators hunt. Not in back alleys, in living rooms, in cars, in conversations that start friendly and end permanent. Elizabeth wasn't doomed by ambition, and she was undone by proximity. To men, to myths, to a city that mistakes beauty for consent. That's the truth before the body, and it's the part that matters most. What we do know for a fact, and what Hollywood keeps screwing up, is this. Elizabeth did have a serious romantic relationship with a military officer during World War II, His name was Michael Gordon Jr. He wasn't a rumor. He wasn't a tabloid invention. He was a real U.S. Army Air Forces officer stationed overseas. They met in Florida. That part is solid. She was living there, moving around military towns the way a lot of young women did during the war. Dance halls, bases, places where uniforms meant hope and distraction. Gordon wasn't some drifter or wannabe actor. He was an actual pilot, trained, commissioned, the real deal. They talked marriage, not Hollywood engagement, not press photos, private plans. According to family accounts and later reporting, they intended to marry when he returned from the war. Elizabeth told people she was engaged. This wasn't her spinning fantasies for attention. Multiple sources back this up. And then reality stepped in. In August 1945, Michael Gordon Jr. died in a plane crash while returning from the war, not in combat, on the way home. One of those cruel footnotes history doesn't linger on. War survived him, travel didn't. Here's where the record stays clean. Elizabeth was not notified immediately. By the time she learned of his death, the war was over, the future she'd been clinging to was gone, and whatever stability she thought she had evaporated overnight. This matters because it punctures one of the biggest myths about her. She wasn't a woman floating aimlessly with no attachments. She wasn't chasing fame because she was empty. She lost something real and then had to keep moving because there was nothing to stay for. And no, before anyone tries to get cute with it, there's zero evidence that Gordon's death is connected to her murder. No secret intelligence files, no mob crossover, no shadow conspiracy. Sometimes tragedy just stacks, but psychologically, it's a pivot point. After his death, Elizabeth drifts west again. California wasn't a dream at that point. It was an escape from grief, from family tension, from being the girl whose future died in the clouds before it ever touched down. And here's the nasty fact Hollywood hates. This wasn't the beginning of some glamorous downfall arc. This was a young woman absorbing loss in a country that didn't care what happened to women once the war ended. The record says she was grieving, and those are not the same thing. Now let's talk about Cleo Short, because this is where the story stops being tragic and starts being cruel. Cleo Short faked his own death during the Depression, abandoned his family completely, left them to grieve a man who was very much alive. Years later, he resurfaces in California. Elizabeth eventually reconnects with him out west. Think about that for half a second. Your father dies, you grow up poor and sick, and then you find out he's been alive, working, and starting over while you were scraping by. They live together briefly. It doesn't last. Why? Because Cleo wasn't interested in parenting. He was interested in control. He criticized her appearance, her behavior, her independence. He didn't rescue her. He judged her. And when she didn't fit his expectations, she was out. So no, Elizabeth didn't have a safety net. She had a man who abandoned her twice. If there's any dark humor in this case, it's that the one person everyone assumes would protect her was the first to disappear and the last to help. After her father kicks her out, Elizabeth doesn't vanish into some Hollywood fantasy. She drifts, and that's not an insult. It's a fact. What we know for sure is this. She doesn't immediately land in Los Angeles and start auditioning. There's no paper trail for that, no contracts, no casting calls, no studio correspondence, none. Anyone telling you otherwise is selling a postcard version of her life. After leaving her father in California, Elizabeth moves around, Florida, back east, then west again. She stays with friends, acquaintances, sometimes men who were interested in her, sometimes women who took pity on her. This wasn't unusual in the 1940s. It also wasn't glamorous. It was couch-to-couch survival. She worked sporadically, waitress jobs, odd work, nothing stable, nothing documented that points to a career path. What is documented is that she was broke often, relied on others, and had no permanent address. LAPD records later confirm that she's essentially transient by the time she returns to Southern California. And here's where people get uneasy. Elizabeth wasn't chasing fame. She was chasing stability, food, shelter, attention from people who might keep her safe another week. That's not ambition. That's survival mode. She tells people she's an actress sometimes. That wasn't lying. It was aspirational shorthand. In 1946, Los Angeles actress could mean anything from studio contract to, I took a headshot once and I need someone to let me sleep on their couch. Context matters. By late 1946, she's back in California for good, not because Hollywood called, but because California was warm, familiar, and full of people who didn't ask too many questions. If you're broke, sick, and floating, that matters more than dreams. No steady job, no apartment, no agent, no plan that anyone can document. Just a young woman with no safety net, moving through a city that ate people like her for breakfast and didn't bother remembering their names afterward. That's the reality. And it's already darker than the myth. Police documented that she was seen regularly. Restaurants, bars, hotels, public places. She was using her real name. She wasn't running from anyone, at least not that she told anyone about. She was last confirmed alive on January 9th, 1947, at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. Witnesses saw her using the lobby phone, calm, composed, waiting, no signs of distress, no evidence she knew what was coming. After that, the trail goes cold. What follows is the part everyone obsesses over: the body, the brutality, the spectacle. When people talk about Elizabeth, they talk about her like she was some strange, rare creature, a one-off tragedy, a Hollywood ghost. That's comforting, because if she's an anomaly, you don't have to look too closely. You see Elizabeth Short every day. You pass her at red lights. She's walking into a diner at 6 a.m. after a night shift. She's sleeping in a car with the windows cracked because it's temporary. She's crashing on couches, moving cities, chasing something vague like stability, or maybe this time it works. Post-war America was full of transient women, young, broke, unattached, drifting between cities, jobs, men, and promises. The country had just chewed through millions of people. Men came back damaged. Women were told to smile, wait, and be grateful. There were no safety nets, no social media, no trauma language. If you fell through the cracks, you fell fast and quietly. What was different was what happened to her, and how much the country decided to stare at the body instead of the system that left her exposed. Today, we pretend this kind of life is new. We slap labels on it. We argue about it online, but strip away the filters and the algorithms, and it's the same pattern: economic precarity, isolation, dependence on strangers, and the lie that the next city will fix everything. The only real difference now is volume and visibility. There are more people, more movement, more noise, more cameras. Back then, women like Elizabeth didn't go viral. They disappeared. So when people ask why her story still matters, the answer isn't about Hollywood or glamour or mystery. It's this: she wasn't a warning sign from another era. She was an early chapter in a story we never finished reading. And if you think it couldn't happen now, look around your commute tomorrow morning. Elizabeth Short became a symbol because she fit the version of victim America pays attention to: young, conventionally attractive, and white. That's not commentary, that's pattern recognition. It was true in 1947, and it's still true now. Her death didn't land in the public consciousness because it was uniquely brutal. Los Angeles had plenty of brutal murders. What made this one explode was how it looked and how it was presented. Her body wasn't discovered, tucked away, or accidentally stumbled upon. It was deliberately placed in a vacant lot, fully visible, posed, clean, and unmistakable. Whoever left her there wasn't hiding a crime. They were staging one. That matters. The press response followed instantly. Headlines fixated on her face, her figure, her photographs. She was aestheticized before she was humanized. The violence became secondary to the image. Editors didn't just report the crime, they curated it. This is the part people dance around. If Elizabeth Short had been older, heavier, darker, or less photogenic, this case would not have become legend. It would have been a paragraph, maybe two, then forgotten. The way her body was found turned the crime into a spectacle. The way she looked made it marketable. Together, those two things guaranteed attention, whether justice followed or not. And it's how investigations get warped before they even begin. This case wasn't unprecedented in 1947. That's the part people forget. Los Angeles in the 1940s already had a steady background hum of extreme violence against women, brutal, sexualized, public-facing, and in many cases just as theatrical. Most of it barely survived past the afternoon edition. Take Jean French, killed just weeks after Elizabeth Short. Her body was found dumped on a roadside in West Los Angeles, beaten, sexually assaulted, and then staged. Someone wrote crude words on her body with lipstick. Newspapers dubbed it the red lipstick murder, ran photos, speculated wildly, then quietly moved on when it didn't sustain sales. Same city, same year, same brutality, nowhere near the same cultural afterlife. There were also multiple prostitute murders in Southern California during the mid-1940s, where attackers inflicted extreme post-mortem injuries. Cutting, posing, and deliberate placement meant to guarantee discovery. In at least one cluster, contemporary police files and newspaper accounts describe the killer as engaging in ritualistic behavior, including claims of blood consumption. That detail didn't come from later internet lore. It came from period reporting and investigator notes, but those victims didn't fit the image editors wanted to immortalize. They were older, poorer, working class. Their names didn't photograph well. There were women found mutilated along highways, others dumped in vacant lots. Some were carved, some were drained. Some were left openly as if daring the city to look. This wasn't new behavior erupting out of nowhere with Elizabeth. It was already in circulation. What was different was the convergence, a photogenic victim, a shocking presentation, and a press corps ready to turn violence into narrative. Same city, same decade, same methods, different spotlight. So when people talk about the Black Dahlia as if she marked some dark turning point, she didn't. She marked a marketing decision. Her murder didn't invent sensationalized violence against women. It didn't even escalate it. It just landed at the exact moment when editors realized how profitable spectacle could be when it came wrapped in beauty and horror. That's the unpleasant part for everyone. Let's be honest about what actually sold this case. Elizabeth was young, white, and conventionally attractive. That combination has always pulled oxygen away from other victims. Editors knew it in 1947, just like producers know it now. Her face photographed well, her nickname stuck, and the way her body was found guaranteed headlines. But here's what never makes it into the mythology. The photos lied by omission. You don't see the dental records. You don't see the decay from years without insurance. You don't see what poverty does to a body when it's been moving place to place without medical care. The press didn't show that Elizabeth was a real, worn-down human being. They sold a polished image because that's what people linger on. Pretty sells, damage doesn't. Here's the part people forget. This wasn't unprecedented even then. Violence against women wasn't rare in the 1940s. Sexualized murder wasn't new. Staged bodies weren't shocking to police departments that had already seen them. What was different here was presentation. Elizabeth Short's case didn't explode because it was uniquely savage. It exploded because it hit the press trifecta: beauty, visibility, and spectacle. People didn't look away because they were horrified. They leaned in because the story was packaged for consumption. That doesn't diminish what happened to her, but it explains why her name survived while others vanished. At the exact same time America was obsessing over her face, other bodies were piling up with equal or worse brutality and nowhere near the same attention. In Los Angeles County, Gordon Northcott had already butchered multiple boys at the Wineville chicken coop. That case involved dismemberment, lime, shallow graves, and prolonged abuse of children. It barely held the nation's attention once the trial wrapped. In Chicago, just months before Elizabeth was killed, William Hirons murdered Suzanne Denyan, dismembered her, and carved a message into her torso. Actual letters cut into human flesh. That should have been the stuff of legend. Instead, it became a regional crime footnote. And nationally, the Cleveland torso murders were still an open wound in the public psyche. Headless, limbless bodies dumped like refuse with no killer ever identified. Adults, men and women, no nickname that stuck, no lasting myth. The violence wasn't rare, the coverage was selective. Elizabeth didn't usher America into brutality. America was already waist deep in it. Her case just had the right packaging at the right moment. I'm not pretending I'm immune to this either. I was pulled into this case the first time I read about it when I was 13. It is horrifying. It is unsettling. And yes, she looks beautiful in those photos. That combination sticks. It gets under your skin. It did mine. That doesn't make anyone shallow. It makes us human. But that pull is exactly the problem. Because for every Elizabeth, there were dozens of women in the same era. Same violence, same brutality, sometimes worse, whose names never stuck because they didn't photograph well, didn't fit the narrative, or didn't make editors pause before turning the page. This case didn't become iconic because it was uniquely evil. It became iconic because it was framed that way. And once you realize that, you can't unsee how many other stories from that time were left on the floor then and now. That's the part that actually deserves attention. Let's talk about the men who've been labeled Elizabeth Short's killer and why none of them carry real evidentiary weight. The Black Dahlia case isn't famous because it's solved. It's famous because it's empty. And humans hate empty spaces. We fill them with stories. Over the years, a rotating cast of suspects has been dragged out. Doctors, surgeons, sadists, failed writers, eccentric geniuses, violent loners. Most of them get attention not because the evidence points to them, but because the aesthetic fits what people want the killer to look like. The most popular name is always the same type. Educated, socially strange, morally deviant, conveniently dead so they can't defend themselves. Because the truth doesn't need lighting, music, or a third act. That's not profiling, that's casting. Professional profilers, the kind who work cases, not book deals, are blunt about this. No named suspect has ever been supported by physical evidence, forensic linkage, or verified witness testimony placing them with Elizabeth at the time of her death. None, not one. Confessions, either secondhand, coerced, exaggerated, or falling apart under basic fact checks. Diaries, unverified. Family accusations, emotional, not evidentiary. Medical theories, overstated. The level of mutilation does not require a surgeon. It requires time, privacy, and familiarity with bodies, things far more common than people like to admit. And that's where the mythology does real damage. By chasing a singular, brilliant, monstrous figure, the public narrative ignores what law enforcement quietly acknowledged even back then. This crime most likely involves someone local, opportunistic, comfortable with violence, and unremarkable enough to disappear into the background. Not a mastermind, not a celebrity, not a name that sells books. The obsession with pet suspects didn't bring justice, it buried it. Every new solution pulled attention away from evidence that could actually be tested. Movements, timelines, witness inconsistencies, geographic familiarity. The case didn't go cold because it was unsolvable. It went cold because it became entertainment before it could become accountable. And here's the part nobody likes. The killer doesn't need a name to still be real. He doesn't need a myth. He doesn't need a narrative arc. He just needs the system to keep chasing ghosts instead of patterns. People love names. They love a villain they can Google, a file they can obsess over, a face to pin the horror on. That's why this case is clogged with suspects who sound good on paper but collapse the second you apply evidence instead of imagination. Over the decades, Elizabeth Short's been pinned on doctors, surgeons, sadists, serial killers, rich weirdos, angry geniuses, and men who happened to live nearby and owned sharp objects. Most of these theories exist because they feel right, not because they hold weight. Confessions, contaminated, attention-seeking, or provably false. Circumstantial coincidences, that's not proof, that's storytelling. handwriting analysis, cryptic letters. He was strange vibes. None of that survives professional scrutiny. Actual profilers, the kind who look at behavior instead of myth, are mostly aligned on one difficult reality. This wasn't a mastermind, and it wasn't some anonymous monster drifting through the night. This was personal, not intimate in a romantic sense. Personal in the way resentment is personal, the way rejection is personal, the way humiliation festers. The behavioral evidence points to a man who knew Elizabeth, not a celebrity stalker, not a surgical savant hunting headlines, someone in her orbit, someone she dealt with out of necessity, not affection. A man she didn't particularly like but tolerated because she needed something, a place to crash, a ride, a little cash, a connection she hoped might pan out. That dynamic matters. Profilers consistently note that the violence inflicted wasn't random or opportunistic. It was controlled, deliberate, focused. The kind of violence that comes from feeling slighted, dismissed, or stripped of power. This wasn't about sexual gratification alone. It was about dominance, punishment, and erasing someone who didn't give him what he thought he deserved. The posing of the body wasn't theatrical genius, it was communication. Anger turned into display. Look what you made me do energy. That doesn't come from a stranger who picked her off the street. That comes from someone who felt rejected and powerless while she was alive. And the location matters more than people want to admit. The body was left in a neighborhood the killer was comfortable in, not a random dumping ground. Somewhere he knew would guarantee discovery, but also allow him to move in and out without drawing attention. The idea that she was abducted by a brilliant predator who planned every detail weeks in advance, that's Hollywood talking. Real violence like this usually grows out of proximity and pressure, not genius. Elizabeth didn't die because she crossed paths with a criminal mastermind. She died because she crossed paths with the wrong man at the wrong time. Someone close enough to feel entitled to her, resentful enough to punish her. That's why this case is still unsatisfying. Because the most likely answer isn't dramatic. It's familiar. Elizabeth was killed sometime around January 14th to 15th, 1947. Cause of death, hemorrhage and shock caused by blunt force trauma to the head and face, combined with severe blood loss. She was alive during at least part of the assault, but she was not tortured for days, and she was not kept captive long term. There is zero evidence for that. Her body was washed after death, not scrubbed for ritual, not bathed lovingly, washed to remove blood and surface evidence. That's practical, not theatrical. She was bisected at the waist using a technique similar to a medical hemicorporectomy. Clean, precise, no hacking. This suggests knowledge, not necessarily a surgeon, but someone comfortable with anatomy and tools. Her body was posed, arms raised, legs apart, placed deliberately in an empty lot. That wasn't sexual display, that was presentation. He wanted discovery, he wanted reaction. There were cuts to her face, the so-called Glasgow smile. These were post-mortem or peri-mortem, not extended sadistic carving sessions like people love to imagine. There was no semen found, no evidence of vaginal rape, no evidence of prolonged sexual torture. That matters. This was not a sex crime in the way people think. Let's burn some bullshit to the ground. She was not forced to eat feces. That rumor came from later tabloid garbage and has no support in the autopsy. She was not drained of blood while alive as some ritual. Blood loss occurred due to trauma, period. She was not carved up slowly over hours or days. There is no evidence of extended torture. She was not a sex slave, not part of a snuff fantasy, and not killed by some elite underground ring. And she was not dismembered as a signature calling card. The bisection served a purpose: transport, staging, and shock value, not fetish. The internet loves a monster movie. Real violence is usually uglier and simpler. The injuries suggest rage, not ritual. The lack of sexual assault suggests rejection, resentment, or control, not gratification. Profilers have been consistent on this for decades. This was likely a man who knew her, or at least knew of her. Someone she interacted with casually, someone she didn't choose, someone she may have depended on briefly for a ride, a couch, money, and then tried to disengage from. That kind of slight burns hotter than obsession. This wasn't a celebrity stalker. It wasn't a mastermind genius. It wasn't a famous doctor playing games. Because the real story isn't dramatic. People want her death to mean something grand. They want codes, letters, masterminds, and boogeymen. But what actually happened is far more terrible than we want to consider. A vulnerable woman crossed paths with the wrong man, one who felt ignored, dismissed, or humiliated. And he made sure she was seen afterward. That's not a mystery people like, that's a mirror. Profilers have been careful with this case for decades, but there is consensus on a few things that don't rely on mythology or shock headlines. First, sadism, not sexual fantasy sadism, because the real explanation isn't built for spectacle, but control-based sadism. The injuries weren't about sexual gratification in the moment. They were about domination, humiliation, and emotional punishment. The precision, the restraint, the pacing of what was done all point to someone who derives satisfaction from power, not chaos. This wasn't a rage killing that spun out of control. It was methodical. That matters. Second, experience. The crime shows signs of someone who had either done this before or had rehearsed it extensively. That doesn't mean a long string of known murders. It means familiarity with bodies, injury, and post-mortem handling. The lack of panic behaviors, the cleanup, the placement, and the confidence and exposure all suggest someone who was comfortable operating in that space. First-time offenders usually leave disorder. This scene didn't. Third, why investigators and profilers have considered wartime experience carefully, not lazily. This is where people get sloppy, so let's be precise. Post-World War II, Los Angeles was flooded with returning servicemen. That alone means, statistically, a suspect pool skewed heavily male and military-aged. But the reasoning goes further than demographics. The controlled violence, compartmentalization, emotional detachment, and ability to carry out prolonged acts without visible distress are traits seen in a subset of individuals exposed to wartime brutality. Not most veterans, not even many, but a small fraction who return psychologically altered and untreated. Profilers are clear on this point. Military service alone does not make someone violent, but untreated trauma combined with pre-existing sadistic traits absolutely can. That combination, prior psychological deviance plus exposure to extreme violence, is why wartime experience stays on the table in professional analysis, not as an accusation, as context. What you don't see here is evidence of ritual, symbolism, or ideological motive. This wasn't a message to society or law enforcement. Bottom line, profilers don't see a mastermind. They don't see a brilliant surgeon. The question people always want answered is whether he had other victims and what became of him. Short answer, very likely, and we'll probably never know his name. Profilers who've reviewed the Black Dahlia case over the decades point to something specific. The crime doesn't read like a first attempt. The level of control, the lack of panic, the post-mortem handling of the body, those are learned behaviors. This wasn't someone spiraling in the moment. This was someone operating inside a pattern. Serial offenders don't usually start at maximum brutality. They escalate. That means Elizabeth may not have been his first victim, just the one that went public. Earlier crimes could have involved less extreme violence, victims who weren't identified, or people society didn't look hard for. Sex workers, transient women, women reported late, or not at all. In the 1940s, that category was enormous. As for what happened to him, there are 3 realistic possibilities, none of them satisfying. 1, he stopped. Not because he was cured, but because something disrupted him. Marriage, children, stable work, aging, or the fear generated by the media frenzy. Some offenders go dormant for decades. 2, he died. Post-war Los Angeles was full of men with untreated injuries, alcoholism, tuberculosis, and psychological damage. A sudden death wouldn't be unusual, and if he died shortly after 1947, the trail ends there. 3, and this one matters, he was never caught because the system wasn't built to catch him. No DNA, no offender databases, no behavioral linkage analysis. Separate murders stayed separate. If he killed again in another city or state, no one connected the dots. What profilers don't believe is that he was a brilliant criminal mastermind who vanished into thin air. More likely, he was a normal man who blended back into conventional life, carrying something no one around him could see. The killer didn't disappear because he was exceptional. He disappeared because the world around him was unprepared to recognize what he was. If people want to believe Elizabeth Short's murder was a freak event, a one-off horror that came out of nowhere, the record doesn't back that up. We know, bona fide, documented, that dozens of murders in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s involved the same core elements. Women killed by men they knew or had contact with. Bodies deliberately displayed excessive violence beyond what was necessary to cause death, and post-mortem staging meant to shock. Los Angeles alone saw multiple sexually sadistic homicides in that era that never reached the public imagination the way this one did. Nationwide, you're easily looking at hundreds of comparable cases across the 20th century when you widen the scope beyond famous names. Men have been killing women this way long before Elizabeth and long after her. We have records from Jack the Ripper's era. We have records from post-war America. We have records now. The methods evolve. The psychology doesn't. What changes is visibility. Most of these murders don't get a nickname. Most victims don't get remembered. Most killers are never mythologized. They're arrested quietly, die anonymously, or simply disappear into history without headlines. She was one data point in a long, ugly continuum of male violence that societies keep pretending is exceptional instead of endemic. That's the part people don't like. Because if you accept that this isn't rare, then you have to accept that it's still happening and that the men who do this don't look like monsters. Here's the part that gets lost when people turn this case into a legend instead of a crime. Homicide data, historical police records, and post-war crime reviews suggest dozens of murders in the 1930s to 1950s involved extreme mutilation, sexualized violence, body posing, and public placement. The same offender profile shows up again and again. Male, controlled, resentful, sexually sadistic, capable of planning, capable of blending in. These men don't burn out quickly. They escalate, adapt, relocate, or age out, sometimes without ever being identified. Some are caught later for different crimes. Some die quietly. Some never face accountability at all. This crime has happened before. It's how many victims never become a story. I'm Becca, and this is Deadly Truth. This isn't about legends, it's about patterns. And the people history turns into symbols instead of understanding. If you want real cases, real evidence, and real context, not myths, not clickbait, follow, subscribe, and share. Because the past isn't dead, it's just being forged in the murder factory.